This happened a few years ago, but it still gives me an unsettling feeling whenever I think about it. The only reason I'm talking about it now is because I feel like it's been long enough since it happened, and I won't risk anything by putting it on the internet. Back then, my wife and I had just moved into the suburbs from the city. We just had our third kid, and between the baby stuff, the toys, and the general chaos, our apartment felt way too cramped. We found a nice house in a quiet, safe neighborhood. The neighbors described as the place where you'd feel fine, leaving the doors unlocked. The house itself wasn't massive, but it was definitely a step up from the tiny space we'd previously been living in. One of the features that caught my wife's eye was the backyard. It had this beautiful, a lightly overgrown garden with a few old statues scattered around. They were weathered, a little eerie looking, like something on a Game of Thrones. I know it sounds weird, but my wife and I loved it. Said it gave our yard character. I was pretty indifferent, so I left everything as it was, statues and all. I figured it was less work for me, which I was never going to complain about. A few days after we moved in, I was looking out the window, taking in the yard, when I noticed something odd. One of the statues, an angel, I think, was facing away from the house. All the others were facing toward us, so it looked strange. I could have sworn they all faced the same direction, but I didn't really know for sure. I didn't think much of it, and just assumed I was misremembering things. The next morning I looked out the window again, and that's when I noticed it. Another statue had turned around again, facing away from the house. This time I knew something was up. I had never been more sure about anything in my life. I asked my wife about it, but she just shrugged it off and said she hadn't noticed anything. I thought maybe it was my son, Jimmy. He was a little prankster back then, always up to something. But when I asked him, he just looked at me like I was nuts. I doubted he'd do something like that anyway. I knew something was going on though, but I couldn't prove it. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, so I tried to ignore it. Besides, I had bigger problems to worry about. I don't like admitting it, but money was really tight during that time, and I lived in perpetual fear that I was going to lose my job. A few days went by without anything strange, and I started to relax. But then one evening, I looked out the window and my heart nearly stopped. All of the statues were lined up in a row at the very edge of the house, just standing there. It was a freakish sight, like something out of a horror movie. I know it sounds ridiculous, but part of me could feel all those eyes looking at me. My breathing went shallow. I couldn't decide whether it was more scary or bizarre. I went outside to get a closer look, trying to make sense of it. Before opening up the back door, I took a few nervous glances around the yard to make sure there was no one out there. It was daylight, but I was paranoid. Eventually, I worked up the courage to open the door and go inspect the statues. I went to lift one of them and immediately realized something. Those statues were heavy, way too heavy for one person to move alone. I couldn't even budge one of them on my own. As I was debating what to do, my wife came outside, and the look on her face told me she was just as freaked as I was. She suggested maybe some of the other neighbors were messing with us, trying to scare the new people on the block. But that explanation literally made no sense. We had met all the neighbors, and they all seemed like fairly normal people. Plus, I had trouble believing that anyone sane would do this to a family with young children. This was harassment, not some harmless prank. We ended up calling the police, but as you might expect, they couldn't do much. They suggested putting up some security cameras, but we didn't have the money for that. I told the cops we would, but on the inside, I was really reluctant to do something so drastic. They left, and I guess I felt a little better, even though my wife was still extremely shaken up. My wife and I did everything we could to hide the situation from our kids. Say what you will, but we didn't want to scare them. Nothing happened the next day or the next. I speculated that the cops had scared whoever was there away, which did track on many levels. So we tried to forget about it, even though neither of us really felt comfortable. I tried to assure myself that maybe my wife was right. Maybe it had just been a prank or something. That didn't do anything to calm my nerves, though. I was on edge, looking out the window every time I passed by, half expecting to see the statues somewhere else. I hope no one ever has to experience the sensation of feeling unsafe in your own home. A few days passed without incident. I started thinking the nightmare was over, and for the first time in a while, the house was actually starting to feel like home. I could not have been more wrong. It was a weekend. I don't remember whether it was Saturday or Sunday, but it was definitely a weekend since my kids didn't have school. After some breakfast, I went outside to play in the yard with my kids, and that's when I saw it. Spray painted in big black letters on the back wall of our house were the words, "Go away." I nearly dropped my son when I saw it. Without thinking, I rushed my kids inside and told my wife to stay in the house with them. I don't know what came over me. I'm not that brave of a guy, but I started sprinting through the garden, screaming threats at whoever had vandalized my house. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins and I was looking for a fight. No one was anywhere in my yard though. Eventually I gave up looking. As I was walking back towards the house, the adrenaline in me turned to outright fear. This was serious. Someone had left a direct message meant to scare us. They could have meant us harm. And I knew the situation was only going to escalate from there. The police came again and took down another report, but without any leads, there wasn't much they could do. I insisted that they stay on the property in case those people came back, but they told me they didn't have enough evidence to waste resources like that. As far as they knew, some teenage delinquents could have been behind the graffiti. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They told me they'd make sure a patrol officer nearby, which I guess was some consolation. My wife was twice as upset as I was, so I reassured her that we'd be okay, even though I was freaking out internally. That night I was in the kitchen when I heard my wife scream from the living room. I ran in, and she was standing by the window pointing outside. I looked and my stomach dropped. There were 5 people standing in our backyard, each of them wearing white face coverings. They were dancing around in a strange, jerky way, almost like puppets. We just stood there watching them, too shocked to move. It was terrifying. I don't know what they were trying to accomplish, but it was the most disturbing thing I'd ever seen. I snapped out in my haze and grabbed the biggest kitchen knife we had. I basically screamed at my wife to call the police, and while she was doing that, I ran out the back door with a knife in my hand. I screamed like a clinically insane person and took one step toward them before instantly regretting it. There were 5 of them and one of me. They could have been armed. Before anything else could happen, I turned and ran back inside the house like a coward. The knife must have scared them though, because they stopped dancing and ran into the garden out of sight. I told my wife to run upstairs, find the kids, and hide, and I guarded the back door in case they tried to break in. By the time the police arrived, those people were gone. The police did a thorough search but couldn't find any trace of them. That was the last withdrawal. I didn't care about the costs. I bought and installed security cameras the next day. My wife was hysterical for weeks after that, begging me to let us move somewhere else. I told her that if one more thing happens that we would, but that we'd probably be screwing ourselves financially if it came to that. Luckily, the cameras must have done the trick because those people never returned. And we never had another incident occur on the property. The scariest thing, though, is that we still live in the same house and never got an explanation for what happened. My wife Taylor and I recently moved out of our old home. She didn't like being so close to her family and wanted to put some distance between us and them. So that's what we did. We don't have kids and she stopped working ages ago, so she was relatively amenable to my suggestions about where to move. I'm an electrician, so bouncing around isn't much of a problem for me. We eventually settled on New Mexico. We've both been rural people all our lives, so it wasn't that drastic of a lifestyle change. That was about 3 months ago, give or take. We found a fantastic deal on a place way out in the country. The house is honestly bigger than we really need, especially since it's just the 2 of us and our black lab Lola. But honestly, we figured we'd make use out of the extra space. Maybe even host some of the friends we'd make. We'd been settled in for a few months when I started noticing something odd. The upstairs lights kept tripping circuits, but the rest of the house would still have power. After this happened once or twice, I knew exactly what the problem was. Like I said, I'm literally an electrician, so this stuff is my bread and butter. I figured it would be an easy fix. Just a matter of rearranging some of the load on the breaker, which in all likelihood was downstairs. Times like those make me happy that I'm the type of guy who knows how to fix things. To be honest, I hadn't spent that much time in the basement since we moved in. I didn't really have a reason to. We looked it over briefly when the realtor showed us the place, but I didn't pay much attention. Come to think of it, I don't think I'd been in there one time since then. Anyway, I walked down the stairs and started looking around for the main breaker. The basement was pretty cluttered, and definitely not the type of space that could be easily used. It looked more like a storage room than a basement. Eventually, I figured out where the main was and started futzing around. After about 10 minutes, I realized where the load imbalance was and told myself I'd rewire it when I had more time. At that point, I was about to go upstairs when curiosity got the better of me. I figured since I was down in the basement already, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to have a look around. After all, this is my house, and it was honestly a little strange that I didn't know every square inch of it. Like I said, most of it was filled with old furniture and a bunch of junk. There wasn't anything particularly interesting down there, and I eventually concluded that trying to transform it to a usable space would be way too much of a hassle. That's when I noticed something odd. In the far corner of the basement, behind a stack of old wooden chairs was a large metal door. It was strange because this wasn't just any door. It looked industrial grade. It was also a lot taller than most normal doors would be, and it seemed pretty thick too. I walked over to it and my suspicions were confirmed. It looked like the type of door you'd see securing a walk-in safe or some panic room. My first thought was maybe it was a tornado shelter or storm room or something. But that would be a weird surprise. You'd think the realtor would have mentioned a feature like that. I tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was locked. I immediately went upstairs and started rummaging through the drawer of keys the previous owner had left behind in case we locked ourselves out or something. But none of them worked on the door. I must have tried like 15 keys or something, but no luck. I eventually told Taylor about it, and she was just as curious about it as I was. I'm still not sure how, but she worked her magic, and we were able to get in contact with the previous owners. It was that exact phone call that took me from curious about the situation to downright concerned. They were a little odd on the phone and would pause every so often, like they were thinking carefully about what they were saying, or trying not to say too much. Part of me wishes I had recorded the conversation. But hindsight is 20/20. When I asked about the door, they got quiet. Eventually, the wife said it was just the safe room in case of a tornado. I told her that was great, but we were unable to use it since it was locked. After another pause, she claimed they'd lost the key and told us to just ignore it. I thought that was extremely unlikely since they had literally left us keys to random doors that we'd probably never need to lock. The way she said it gave me a really bad feeling in my gut, too, but there was nothing I could do. We ended up hanging up almost immediately after that, as they were definitely not trying to make small talk. Taylor, my mother, tried to laugh it off, told me I was overthinking it, but I couldn't let it go. Over the course of the next few weeks, I would occasionally wander down the stairs and just stare at that door, wondering what could be inside. I tried everything I could think of to open it, even some tricks I'd picked up from work, but it was no use. The lock was solid. I ended up giving up for about a week, but the curiosity ultimately got the better of me. Fast forward to 2 days ago when things took a wild turn. After, in my wife's wishes, I decided to hire a locksmith. He came over, and I let him do his thing down there. After about 30 minutes, I went downstairs to check on him. He told me that the lock was unusually complex for a simple panic room. Those were his exact words. I was worried he wouldn't be able to get it open, but to my surprise, he actually managed to crack it after another half hour. I wish he hadn't. Inside, the room was set up like some shrine. There were old black and white photographs on the walls, all covered in strange symbols that I didn't recognize. In the center was a chair just facing the wall. It looked like someone had spent a lot of time sitting there, just staring at nothing. In one corner, there was a cot with crumpled blankets, and it smelled stale and gross. Then I noticed the trash, empty chip bags, crumpled water bottles. The realization smacked me in the face. Someone had actually been staying down there, and not that long ago. I was dumbfounded. I didn't think the situation could get much worse. But of course, that's what happened. As I was trying to take it all in, I noticed a second door on the far right side of the room. It was small and half hidden by the minimal light, but it was there. I opened it and realized it led to a set of stairs that led to the cellar door outside the house. I felt like such an idiot. I hadn't even had the foresight to check the cellar door when we moved, since I just assumed it led to the basement. In all the time we'd lived here, I had never even opened it. My bewilderment at the whole thing soon became terror. Someone had literally been living in my house for who knows how long. Things started clicking in my brain. Since moving in, my wife and I had noticed a few weird things that we couldn't explain. Most of the time it was just things going missing. Until that point, I had just assumed my wife had misplaced things, which she did have a tendency to do. This discovery changed everything though. Someone had been living in our house. I had to repeat that thought a dozen times in my head before I could fully wrap my mind around what was going on. I didn't know who had been in there or why, but I knew I didn't want them coming back. I tried calling the previous owners, demanding an explanation, maybe even threatening legal action, but they wouldn't pick up. Either they disconnected their number, or they just didn't want to deal with it. Taylor was freaked out, and I was too. That night, I took some heavy furniture and barricaded the cellar door from the inside. I found a heavy-duty looking chain and padlocked it shut for good measure. I didn't care what it took. There was no way I was letting someone sneak back in through that door. The police came and took down a full report before leaving, telling us they'd do their best to try and get in contact with previous owners. We even called our realtor, who was horrified and said she'd assist the police in any way she could. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, we heard it. There was a loud bang on the front door. Lola shot up, barking like crazy, and we both froze. Neither of us moved, just staring at each other, listening. After a few minutes, the banging stopped. But then we heard small rocks tapping against our bedroom window. Taylor held on to Lola, and I went to look out the window. Taylor begged me not to, but I was furious at that point. In my mind, I was preparing to fight whoever was out there. I grabbed the baseball bat from under the bed and yanked the curtains away from the window, but I couldn't see a thing. We thought it was over. Taylor wanted me to call the police, but there was a little part of me that wanted to handle this myself. I knew the police would scare them away and call it pettiness, but I wanted to make sure whoever was out there got caught. I told her if one more thing happened, I'd call. But then from downstairs, I heard the sound of glass shattering. I sprinted downstairs just in time to see there were two figures running away from the house. The kitchen window was completely shattered. It was then that I called the police, who showed up not long after. They searched the house and the basement, but there was no sign of forced entry into the storm room. They didn't find anyone on the property either. Their best guess was that whoever had been living down there was angry when they realized they were locked out and decided to come back and scare us. I work as a bartender at a bar and restaurant in a suburb just outside Baltimore. I'll do my best to explain the layout so the story makes sense. It's a busy place with a unique setup. There are no waiters, just bartenders like me and the cooks in the back. If you want to find food or non-alcoholic drinks, you have to order them at the bar, and when everything's ready, you grab it from the counter. I'm not sure why things are done that way, but I guess it had something to do with management, being cheap and trying to avoid hiring waiters. Either way, it keeps things fast-paced, which I actually like. For whatever reason, the place is really popular, even though I personally don't think it's anything super special. The atmosphere is lively those nights with great music, a buzzing crowd, and a standing area near the DJ booth where people gather to dance and chat. The constant flow of customers and the high-energy vibe make the job fly by. I love meeting and talking to new people, so the gig is perfect for me. I would probably lose my mind if I had to wait long periods of time between serving guests, but that's just me. I bet some people are the opposite. That particular night started off like any other. It was a weekend, so things were going to be super busy. I was ready. After a certain time, the bar started filling up with people. It looked like more of a younger college crowd that night, which meant more dancing, more spilling, and a rooty environment in general. Oh yeah, and worse tips, which sucked for me. This one group of kids just kept on ordering round after round of tequila, shots faster than I could line up the salt and limes. It's always chaos when they take over the bar. One of them was so plastered, he was the same pickup line on me like 3 times. I was running around doing my thing when I noticed an elderly couple walk in and sit down at the booth in the corner of the restaurant. At first glance, there was nothing strange about them. I just thought it was interesting that two people that age would want to come into a rowdy place like this. I didn't have too much time to think about it though, so I went back to work. Fast forward maybe 30 minutes to an hour, I was halfway through pouring a line of gin and tonics when I noticed the couple again. My hands kept working, muscle memory taking over, but my brain was stuck on them for some reason. That's when it hit me. They were just sitting there motionlessly. They hadn't ordered anything either. No food, and definitely not any drinks I would have remembered. I looked a little closer and realized that they weren't even looking at each. They were both fixated at the wall next to them. From what I could tell, it didn't look like they were talking either. It was the strangest thing. I was beyond curious, but the bar was slant, and I had too much to do to spend time wondering about it. I figured they might be waiting for someone, or didn't realize how the place worked. Maybe they were waiting for a waiter to take their order. When I finally had a break, I decided to check on them myself. I walked over to the table and put on my most polite smile. As I approached, neither of them turned to face me. They were both still staring at the wall like statues. I cleared my throat and asked them if they wanted anything to eat or drink. The woman didn't even flinch. She kept staring at the wall like I hadn't spoken at all. The man turned his head slowly, like he was moving in slow motion. When his face came into view, I felt a chill run through me. His skin was pale and wrinkled, and his eyes were almost sunken into his face completely. He didn't speak, just staring at me, and shook his head once, firmly but silently. Something about the way he looked at me made my stomach twist. I muttered something in response and quickly returned to the bar. I had the weirdest feeling in my gut after that. Those people looked like they didn't even belong in this century, let alone this bar. I didn't look over at that booth for a long time. Eventually, things started to die down a little, and I remembered the couple. I glanced over impulsively, and I nearly dropped the glass I was holding. Both of them were staring directly at me now. I made direct eye contact with the woman, but she never averted her gaze. I don't think I'd ever been more uncomfortable at my job than I was in that moment. I looked away and pretended to be busy, trying not to freak out completely. By the time I glanced back again, the booth was empty. I was relieved. I was just glad that they were gone, as mean as that sounds. By the end of the night, I was still thinking about the whole thing. As I wiped down the bar and closed up with my coworker, Karen, I decided to ask her if she saw anything strange. She's, I guess, what you would call a vet. She's been working there for years and prides herself on noticing everything and everyone that comes through the doors. When I asked her about the couple, she gave me a confused look and said she didn't know what I was talking about. I looked at her blankly and told her I was talking about the elderly couple that was sitting in the corner booth. She shook her head and told me she didn't remember seeing anyone like that. She jokingly asked me if I was hallucinating, which got a playful laugh out of me. But on the inside, though, I was losing it. I knew what I had seen. I asked her if she was sure, and she crossed her arms before listing at least 10 random people who had ordered food that night and what they were wearing. I laughed again and complimented her memory. But like I said before, I was dying on the inside. By the time we locked up, I started doubting myself. As I walked to my car, I noticed something that made me nearly drop my keys in fear. Across the street, there were two dark figures standing under a lone streetlight. I knew it was them. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. I didn't wait another second. I jumped into my car door, locked the doors, and sped out of the lot without another look. The drive home was awful. I was trying not to break down the whole time. I just kept repeating, "Oh my God," over and over. I had so many questions. Had Karen somehow missed them? Were those people even real? Was I going insane? I couldn't explain it. I thought I was going crazy. I wish this story had a resolved ending, but it doesn't. I never saw those people again. I never got any explanation. I don't think I ever will.